Welcome back. Let's get straight to the action. The village of Kamenskoye is currently under the full control of the Russian armed forces. In the southern part of the village of Plavny, the Ukrainian armed forces launched counterattacks, but most Russian personnel have been redeployed to this point, and they continue to push the Ukrainian forces back towards Plavny. There is also information that Russian forces are present in Stepanohirsk, where active offensive operations are ongoing in the village and in the northern part of the village of Plavny. We continue to monitor the developments. Moving on to the Mala-Tokmachka front. In the villages of Stepov, Mali-Shcherbaki, and Shcherbaki, active offensive operations towards the village of Pavlivka have been ongoing for over a week. However, no new information has been received in the past few days. Russian forces continue to push the Ukrainian armed forces back towards Pavlivka. Shelling of Ukrainian personnel is also reported in the villages of Magdalinivka, Novoboykivsk, Lukyanivsk, Novoyakovlivka, Pavlivka, and Zapasna. As for Mala-Tokmachka, offensive operations by Russian forces continue in the northern part of the village, but there are also counterattacks from the Ukrainian side in the southern part. There have been no combat operations in the residential area yet. We will continue to monitor this village. Next, we turn to the Mirn and Huliaipol fronts. As you know, this part of the forests and fields north of the villages of Mirn and Zahern is under the control of the Russian army. In Zahern, the Ukrainian armed forces have been pushed back and there are no longer any battles. However, in Mirn, counterattacks from the Ukrainian side are taking place, and fighting is still ongoing in the northern part of this village. Regarding Huliaipol, Vysoke remains under Ukrainian control, but further south on the map, active offensive operations are being conducted towards Huliaipol by Russian forces, and there is information about fighting on the outskirts of Huliaipol. Shelling of Ukrainian personnel is also reported in the villages of Zatishia, Vesela, and Zeleny High, and active combat operations are underway on the approaches to Vysoke. Moving on to the Malinivka and Timirivka fronts. Malinivka is under the full control of the Russian armed forces, and no new information has been received for over a week. Active combat operations continue on the outskirts of Poltavka itself, as well as west of the villages of Vishneve and Stepov, where Russian forces continue their offensive operations towards Poltavka and Olhivske. As for Timirivka, this part of the forests and fields near the villages of Zeleny Pol, Novopol, Novodarivka, and Timirivka is currently under the control of the Russian armed forces. However, the northern part of Timirivka is still under Ukrainian control, and active combat operations are currently taking place there. Next, we turn to the Malivka and Zeleny High fronts. The forests and fields from Pidubne to Malivka are under the full control of the Russian armed forces. Active combat operations are still ongoing on the outskirts of Malivka, and active combat operations have also begun in Sishneve and Oleksandrorad. FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian positions are reported in the villages of Vorone, Novoselivka, and Lisne. Regarding Zeleny High and the surrounding areas, they are under the control of the Russian armed forces, and Russian troops have gradually advanced along the supply road towards the village of Andriivka-Klevtsova. Information now indicates that active combat operations have begun on the outskirts of this village. Moving on to the Novokadka and Dakhne fronts. As for the villages of Novokadka, Hrushivska, and Yalta, there were recent counterattacks by Ukrainian forces towards Hrushivska, but they failed. Now Russian forces have pushed the Ukrainian army back into the forests and fields north of these villages and continue to do so. The villages of Novokadka, Hrushivska, and Yalta are themselves already under the full control of the Russian armed forces. Regarding Dakhne, the map has been updated, but this entire area from Dakhne to Oleksivka and Orikiv is under the control of the Russian armed forces. However, mopping up operations are still ongoing in this pocket of forests and fields, and it is gradually coming under the control of the Russian army. Next, we turn to the Udakny and Kotlin fronts. Kotlin is currently under the control of the Russian army, while Udakny is under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. The southern territories of Udakny are currently under the control of the Russian army, and the advance is gradually proceeding towards the supply road, west of the village of Udakny. Fighting is also taking place on the outskirts of Udakny itself. Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivske fronts. The Russian army has already entered the center of Pokrovsk, and active combat operations are continuing in the streets. On the Pokrovsk front, active combat operations are already underway in the northern part of the village. Novukrainka is also under the full control of the Russian armed forces, and all active combat operations have currently shifted to the villages of Chunishina and Novopavlivka, and are continuing towards Pokrovsk. Moving on to the Hrodivka front. Mykolaiivka and Hrodivka are under the control of the Russian armed forces. Active combat operations have currently shifted to Promen and Kozatske. Offensive operations from multiple axes are continuing towards Mirnorad. Next, we turn to the Novo-Ekonomichne and Chervony Lyman fronts. Mykolaiivka and Novo-Ekonomichne are also under the full control of the Russian army, and offensive operations continue towards Mirnorad. Information indicates that this part of the territories and villages is under the full control of the Russian armed forces. Active combat operations are taking place in the villages of Sukutske, Zatishok, Nikonarivka, Pankivka, Chervony Lyman, and on the outskirts of Rodinske. Offensive operations are continuing towards Volodymyrivka. There is also information that active combat operations have begun near the villages of Bilitska, Dorozhna, Ivanivka Nova, and Shakova. Moving on to the Poltavka and Rusin Yar fronts. In Poltavka, combat operations are still ongoing, but the village is gradually coming under the control of the Russian army. On the outskirts of Rusin Yar, active offensive operations are now underway for control of this village. Active offensive operations are also continuing towards Volodymyrivka,